Welcome everybody to another edition of Retracing History here on Redoubt Productions. Today we are in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on the National Military Battlefield Park, or I already botched that up, but we're going to keep going. Bear with me folks, because we're visiting a site that got a lot of attention due to preservation work that was achieved by the American Battlefield Trust. Now, I've been on these grounds when I was a little boy, and it didn't really look like a battlefield. It looked like a free-range circus, complete with hotel, gift shop, and I did enjoy that gift shop, by the way. That's no shade, but it is always nice to see something restored to how it would have appeared during its moment in history. So, today, we are visiting what is called Robert E. Lee's headquarters at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So I don't have any notes going in on this episode. This is a spur of the moment. I had to pick something up at a nearby sutler shop. So I am reading from the Civil War Trust and Civil War Trails signage here. So credit is to them for the following dialogue. In any case, people have been living peacefully in and around Gettysburg for more than 75 years before the war, which brought two mighty armies to town and forever changed its landscape. Mary Thompson, a widow since the 1840s, lived in this stone house for 17 years prior to the battle. Mrs. Thompson raised her children here, tended a small garden, and was comforted, I should say, by a dog with its own doghouse. By the summer of 1863, the widow's children had grown and left. One lived directly across the street, and Mrs. Thompson lived alone in this residence. Her closest neighbor was Caspar Henry Dustman, whose home stood just east of the Thompson House. Located on Chambersburg Pike on top of Seminary Ridge, her home was all but doomed to be part of the battlefield. Union cannons dealt death and destruction from her yard, and Union soldiers formed a line of battle near her property's border. After a fierce action, Confederates, cannons, and even the Army's commander, Robert E. Lee, occupied her grounds. Soldiers were buried here. You are standing on historic and hallowed ground. And this sign from the American Battlefield Trust, and for the record, I mentioned in an earlier video, Civil War Trust has since reformed as the American Battlefield Trust. Same entity. This is just giving you a nice image of what this portion of Cemetery Ridge would have once looked like. And you can see the railroad cut, the Dustman barn, the house of the Sheets family, Dustin House, and then it's kind of hard to see due to the trees, but this is where we're currently standing, and this is the Chambersburg Pike. Give you a comparison. That highway, US 30, is the Chambersburg Pike. Here's the Mary Thompson House. The Dustman House would have been basically where the parking lot currently is. And you're looking at the ruins of the Dustman farm. Now, for a number of years, when this was a hotel, this was the foundation for a suite to that hotel. But when they went and restored the property, they just left the period-correct foundation. And I don't think we're going to be able to see it, but no, we will not be able to. But just over in that direction is the Sheets house, which is a iconic landmark. If you've seen views of the battlefield, view of Gettysburg looking east into downtown, the Sheets house is in the foreground. And if you ever watched the movie Gettysburg, they did an interesting, what I think was a matte painting reproduction of that panorama. So you can see the Sheets house is painted blue in the movie. Roughly, those photographs have been taken right on top of the roof of the Dustman house. At least, that's my educated guess. Again, I don't have notes for this episode. And the railroad cut's right over here. And then this railroad cut became the scene of heavy fighting on July 1st. Confederate forces actually ended up using it as a makeshift trench. Problem was, in certain areas, you kind of see there's a swell in the valley. So either it was too low to provide protection, or it was too high and basically couldn't shoot over it. And ultimately, elements of the Iron Brigade made their way in a charge across the Chambersburg Pike, smashed into Confederate forces that were within the railroad cut, and captured them. And there are several fantastic videos on YouTube that go in more detail about that action. I will be linking one. Should be popping up in the corner right now. If not, the description's in the page below. While everyone calls the house the Lee's headquarters, General Lee only stayed a handful of days. Its sole occupant on the eve of battle was Mary Thompson, born Anne Marie Long in 1793.
Mrs. Thompson's life was one of frequent unluck, being twice widowed. Her second husband had abandoned her and her family of several children, with the eldest daughter petitioning the county to have her stepfather noted as a habitual drunkard. The cost of raising a large family and period laws prohibiting married women from owning property forced a sheriff's auction of her Seminary Ridge residence in 1846. Fortunately, lawyer Thaddeus Stevens purchased the property in trust on her behalf. At this point in time, Stevens had recently moved out of Gettysburg to Lancaster in the wake of failed business ventures to muddy his otherwise lauded law practice. Stevens would go on to be a Republican congressman whose opposition towards slavery became increasingly apparent as the country approached civil war. During said conflict, he became one of the Lincoln administration's key allies in Congress. It should be noted he maintained ownership over the Thompson residence during this time, adding a dose of serendipity for what's about to happen on the property.
So, one of the well-known aspects about Gettysburg is actually its opening actions, where people are aware of John Buford, the cavalry commander. Cavalry. I always butcher translation. I apologize. Just bear with me. I'm a Yinzer. I butcher the English language. Well, General Buford brought his units of cavalry to bear west and north of Gettysburg and performed a delaying action due to the series of ridges. They provide natural defenses where these cavalrymen could dismount, move to the farthest ridge west, which was Hare Ridge, put out skirmishers, try to hold back the Confederate infantry that's advancing down the Chambersburg Pike, then fall back to the next ridge, and then the next ridge, that final ridge being here on Seminary Ridge, until a large portion of the Army of the Potomac could deploy. That wing of the Army of the Potomac that will get out here in the nick of time was led by General John Reynolds. Reynolds will be killed out in the woods just over my shoulder just a few moments upon arriving and relieving Buford. But one of the groups that come out here when Reynolds arrives is the 4th U.S. Artillery. And in particularly, one of the companies are actually going to put their guns right here on top of Seminary Ridge on the property of Mary Thompson. These guns were commanded by Lieutenant James Stewart. He's going to have 3 guns aiming across these fields just south of the Chambersburg Pike. But he's also going to have to eventually turn another 3 of his guns to face more to the north as additional Confederate forces start attacking Oak Hill.
Stewart's Battery B was the only regular artillery battery in the 1st Corps going into Gettysburg. They were in a brigade of several volunteer batteries commanded by Charles S. Wainwright. Stewart was a Scottish immigrant that had a dozen years of service to Battery B. Perhaps no man of this portion of the Union line had a better understanding in coordinating field guns in battle than him. Yet he and his subordinate, Lieutenant James Davidson, were put in peril due to the fog of war. The Germanic dialect of an 11th Corps staff officer convinced Wainwright that instructions were to stand fast on Seminary Ridge. In actuality, the command was to protect Cemetery Hill south of town, where the 11th Corps were preparing to evacuate. In the ensuing chaos as the Confederates closed in upon the Thompson House, both Stewart and Davidson were wounded. A member of the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry would later recall the scene. Seminary Ridge blazed with a solid sheet of flame, and the missiles of death that swept its western slope no human beings could endure.
Now, Stewart's battery were also guarded by the 143rd Pennsylvania on this portion of Seminary Ridge. They held out as long as they could throughout July 1st, but the Confederates eventually were able to mount more soldiers on the west and north side of Gettysburg, which compelled the 1st and 11th Corps of the Union Army to evacuate for the town, and all that street fighting will ensue just behind me. The Confederates rush up onto this hillside, capturing it, and immediately see the advantage of it. Keep in mind, again, Gettysburg is much more built up than it was in 1863, so if you're standing on this porch of Thompson's house, you'd have a pretty darn good vantage of what was happening in town, and you would have a decent advantage of what's happening to the south of town as well. And maybe it was this good observation that this house had as to why the commander of the Army of North Virginia, Robert E. Lee, made his headquarters on this property. So, this structure has been called for many years as the Robert E. Lee headquarters. Here's the situation, I'm calling it that. Per the records, Robert E. Lee avoided trying to put his headquarters inside a private residence. Instead, he preferred having his headquarters in a tent. There is no other engagement where he records putting his headquarters anywhere else. Why would he change the matter? Why would he board inside the Thompson House and nowhere else in his military career? Now, there are people who also counter and say, well, Robert E. Lee was not well during the Gettysburg campaign. And this is true. Robert E. Lee was very sickly during his campaign, which may explain some of the decisions he makes a few days later, cock-off Pickett's charge. And they argue because of his ill health in the field, he made an exception inside the board inside of residence. Then you have the matter of looking at different maps from the battle, and they put Lee's headquarters everywhere. Some put it on the north side of the Chambersburg Pike, where the house is. Some people put it on the south side of the Pike. Nobody quite knows where precisely Robert E. Lee's headquarters stood during the Battle of Gettysburg, but it was near the Mary Thompson House. That is a given. It was somewhere on this portion of Seminary Ridge where Robert E. Lee had his headquarters.
The skepticism I just demonstrated on camera is one multiple Gettysburg enthusiasts have displayed in the past century, but in this circumstance, skepticism has led me astray. I have now found multiple sources from Confederates and civilians that agree Lee conducted some level of business within these stone walls, included an encounter with Confederate cavalry commander Jeb Stuart that's become mythologized in books and movies. This begs the question, why did so much skepticism build up in the years after the battle? For one, residents immediately after the battle weren't going to commemorate the structure that housed the leader of an invading force. Second, the house became scandalous at the turn of the 20th century when it was discovered to be hosting a brothel. Finally enters a 1907 article by Henry S. Moyer, which claims his smoking gun that the headquarters was elsewhere was via a good friend that he had heard from noted Gettysburg historian John Bockhelder. He had interviewed Robert E. Lee in the late 1860s, and that the Army in Northern Virginia commander had set his tent in an apple orchard across the Chambersburg Pike. To make matters worse, the National Military Park emblazoned said unsighted quote on a headquarters marker erected on the south side of the road. This cemented the misconception that befell many for centuries. Hopefully, the American Battlefield Trust's efforts in restoring the Thompson House to its original configuration will end such confusion. The controversy doesn't end there, as many have questioned where exactly Mary Thompson was during the battle. Did she seek shelter in her basement or at her son's house across the Pike? Gettysburg resident Catherine Foster describes a scenario I wouldn't have expected from the 69-year-old widow. Occupants of the seminary and other buildings on the ridge came running down the hill faster than double quick. Old Lady Thompson, occupant of Lee's headquarters, however, never deserted her house. Her house and lot were filled with Union wounded and dying during the first day. She remained to care for them and had a daughter living at the foot of the hill, who baked up a barrel of flour into bread, which she carried up the hill to the wounded and refused to cease doing so during the 3 days. Her clothes were riddled with bullets. She was about 70 years of age. In the aftermath of the battle, Mary Thompson faced the reality that most residents in Gettysburg had to endure, that was excessive property damage and burials on their premises. Mary Thompson continued to live at the residence on Seminary Ridge for the rest of her life. Thaddeus Stevens continued to financially support her until his death in 1868. Mary Thompson passed away in 1873.
And one of the cool things is when they restored the house, yes, they even added the doghouse, which shows up in the Matthew Brady photograph. So it was here during the Battle of Gettysburg. We don't know if the dog's name was actually Austin or not. That was a Battlefield Trust decision. Anything hanging in there today? If you want to see some footage of the interior better than what I'm doing, check out the American Battlefield Trust videos on this. Also, check out their team up with Little Wars TV. Just a few years ago, they played a tabletop war game of the Battle of Gettysburg inside the headquarters building. with the establishment of the Lincoln Highway just feet from Thompson's front door in the early 20th century, well, this was a very easy attraction for travelers to stop in their vehicles to get a break and explore a small piece of the Gettysburg battlefield. If there was going to be a piece of this history that most people were going to explore, it was going to be this residence. And coupled with the, let's just say, the idolization of Robert E. Lee in the early 20th century that occurred, that always hyped up Robert E. Lee, who lost the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War overall, but never talked about the man that actually defeated him here, George Gordon Meade, the Union commander. This became one of the attractions in Gettysburg. So much so that, well, a hotel got built around it, and a second floor was installed on top of it, and a gift shop was attached to its side. So when you came here in the early 2000s, you'd come up here and it was an amalgamation of structures. That's how I remember coming up here. This was the Lee's Headquarters Museum, and you would go inside. It was just a one-room museum. To be fair, they had a lot of cool artifacts, a lot of which is now in the collections of the Gettysburg National Military Park and a few other smaller collections. But it wasn't a proper depiction of what this landscape looked like. When you would be on the other two ridges, Seminary Ridge was blighted by this development. So there was a desire over the years to restore this to its battlefield appearance, and in the 2010s, the American Battlefield Trust, then called the Civil War Trust, helped to orchestrate this preservation movement. And this is arguably their most famous project they've thus far done. They had purchased a lot of pieces of battlefield before this, but never have they purchased a property, a building, a structure from a battle, and then completely transformed it back to as it appeared during the American Civil War. And we've just actually walked into a bit of a honor roll for members of the association and other individuals that contributed to the preservation of this site. The Mary Thompson House, also known as the Robert E. Lee's headquarters, is a perfect example of what can be achieved through preservation efforts, that it is possible to get a group together to raise the necessary funds and the necessary manpower to bring back a piece of our past. And why go through all this effort of bringing something back to its original appearance when, you know, the house is pretty bare bones today except for select events? Why do all this effort? Well, this is the closest we'll ever get to probably creating a time machine where we can go back and relive key moments of our past, like the Battle of Gettysburg, without getting harmed as a result of it, so the bullets aren't actually hitting us. So if you're able to preserve or restore a piece of property to how it appeared when a historical event occurred on it, you can transport anybody back to that period in time and educate them. And I know education's a scary word because it is often associated with a bleached white wall with a chalkboard and, you know, the lone American flag and these rickety desks and, you know, all these boring textbooks and repeat after me, July 1st, 1863. No, that's not how you're going to get people interested. How you're going to get people interested is by actually touching the past, getting close to it, being able to get teleported back to that time and realize you're not too dissimilar from the people that were on this property, be it Mary Thompson, who had to appeal to a civic leader to help them out in a time of need, or be it these soldiers that crossed over this grounds fighting. Either they cared, either they were sincere in their cause, or they were kind of roped into this mess, and this was the best way that they could ensure the safety of their loved ones, and in some cases, the safety for themselves. Well, I'd like to thank you for coming here to the Mary Thompson residence, sometimes known as the Robert E. Lee headquarters. If you never have the chance to visit here personally, I hope this is a way of this is as close as I can to replace that experience, but nothing replaces actually standing on hallowed ground like this. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button down below, wherever you're watching, be it YouTube or Rumble. And if this is the first time you've come and checked out Redoubt Productions and you enjoyed this and you want to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to our channel. And if you want to join our garrison and help in my efforts of documenting historic locations like this, you can join our garrison through Ko-fi. Our link is in the description below. It's a small membership, but in turn for supporting me, you will get access to select scripts and notes from my live streams and videos. You'll also get what I call digital postcards, which are essentially behind the scenes photographs, much like of what I'm doing right now. Get a little tidbits of what I'm up to out and exploring. And you have my undying gratitude for supporting the channel. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you in the next video.